Frank Gaffney joins me now, founder and president of the Center for Security Policy. Frank, thanks for joining us. And I know that there were people already ready to ridicule Donald Trump for announcing the creation of a U.S. Space Force. And in fact, the memes on Twitter started right away in that regard. But this does seem like something we're going to have to move into as both communications and weapons of one kind or another move into space, isn't it?
Well, of course, both communication systems and weapons have been in space or passing through space for decades and decades. So we're kind of late to the party, I think, especially, Lars, as nations like Russia and China have been very assiduously building up their capacity to exercise really a dominant position in space to the point where we've had a hard time getting there until fairly recently, and mostly as a result of progress in the private sector. But I think this Space Force is very much an idea whose time has come. It is a great credit to the president that apparently over the objections of the Pentagon, he's decided he wants to have a sixth military service with this as its specific dedicated responsibility. And I think that has the promise to really begin to address both these threats and the urgent needs for us to up our game in space more generally.
Well, and in fact, if you have young men and women who are specifically assigned to that and then specifically trained to be expert in that, and you shift your focus a bit and say, we can't just have an Air Force, we have to have a Space Force, it seems sensible because there are parts of that are going to be peculiar only to space defense that aren't necessarily going to benefit just from somebody who's highly trained in the Air Force, right?
Well, that's part of it. But honestly, there's a little bit more of a bureaucratic thing going on here. If the Air Force is responsible for space, as it has been now for quite some time, it's invariably the case that space is going to receive less priority than the things that really matter to the Air Force, which are the things that they get to fly,
right,
whether it's fighter aircraft or whether it's bombers or what have you. And I think that is a misplaced priority that we can simply no longer afford to indulge in.
By the way, I want to shift gears just a bit and go to the IG report and the FBI. Are we ever going to see the people who were held accountable, who were behind all of this? And I almost feel as though the Inspector General is getting an earful from Member of Congress Trey Gowdy today, because Gowdy sees that they were trying to excuse the agency as being, there was no sign of bias at the FBI. And I think all of us who read that report saw plenty of signs of bias there, and almost another attempt to excuse this agency from the kinds of actions that it was engaged in. And for all we know, the deep state is still doing this kind of thing. So where does this go next?
It's a great question, Lars. I think you're right. It, of course, was political bias specifically that the Inspector General said there was no evidence of it. And that's just nonsense. Page after page after page is redolent with examples of Peter Strzok, you mentioned a moment ago, frog marched out of the building a short while ago, or not frog marched literally, I guess, in chains, but certainly escorted by armed guards, is a sign to me that things are beginning to turn to investigating those who have been involved in this kind of political bias. You asked, I guess, rhetorically the question, why would Mueller have brought Strzok aboard? I think it's pretty clear he brought him aboard because everybody in the system knew he was the guy who was going to try to stop Trump. And he was the guy who was saving Hillary Clinton's bacon, with others, of course, but a prime mover behind that. So he was kind of a go-to guy for fixing these things, and I believe that's why Bob Mueller brought him and a bunch of other folks who also had a partisan political agenda to do this investigation of Donald Trump and his campaign and the so-called collusion.
Well, I'm going to run some of these sound bites later on tonight, but Gowdy was raising the question, rhetorically, just as I did, saying, why was it that when Hillary Clinton was being investigated, that Mueller wrote, or Comey wrote, the conclusion of the investigation before he'd even talked to Hillary Clinton? He wrote it before the investigation was even over. So it was not just foreordained, or preordained, that it was already done. The investigation was finished before it started or before it interviewed the prime suspect, Hillary Clinton. And yet with President Trump, James Comey saw the need to memorialize every conversation he had with the president and then secretly turn over that data in violation of federal law. And he treated the two very differently, and that seemed to indicate political bias as well. And then, as you point out, Robert Mueller making the decision to bring on this known Trump hater, this man who had vowed to stop Trump from becoming president so that they could, I guess, destroy the president after he became president.
Yeah. I was talking to a really smart guy on these issues, Hans von Spakovsky of the Heritage Foundation.
Real good guy.
Earlier today. And I was sort of teasing out with him what was going on here, and he said that you had clearly what we were being told in those hearings and in the report to some extent, namely that this was just business as usual. What was done with Hillary was just by the book and so on. No, it wasn't, and the contrast couldn't be more stark, of course, between what was done with Hillary on the one hand and what was done with Trump in these two investigations. But I said, are either of them by the book? And Hans said, no, they're both kind of extremes, polar extremes to be sure, but extremes, neither one of which, the way they went after Trump wasn't really consistent with the standard operating procedure, and for sure the way they dealt with Hillary wasn't. So it's important, I think, Lars, for all of us who know how critical the FBI is, how critical the Department of Justice are, to the rule of law in our society, that we get back to having some basis for confidence that it actually is the case, that they're serving the rule of law and not abusing it or undermining it. And I think in both of these cases, that's exactly what they were doing.
Absolutely. Frank, thank you very much. I appreciate the time and what you do at the Center for Security Policy in D.C.
Thank you, Lars.